off. Right. And we are recording the portion that's the panelists, not the small groups later in the evening. So a few months ago, when there was particular attention after the horrific murders in Atlanta to anti-Asian violence, and also more attention in the Bay Area to individual acts of violence that had been taking place against Asian and Asian American people. One of our members, Lionel, said to the board, we must do something that will both educate and inspire us to take a stand and do something. So with the upcoming Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month in May, we were able to secure 3 spectacular speakers who will both educate and inspire us tonight to get us thinking about how it is that we can take a stand on challenging anti-Asian violence in our midst, and particularly as religious people, how can we do this? So this is an event of the Peninsula Multifaith Coalition, and so we found 3 religious leaders who are experts, each in their way, as religious leaders, as social activists, and who also bring, because of their social location, personal and professional experience on this topic. So I'm going to introduce the 3 of them individually and then turn it over to them. And we'll be in this panelist format until 7:50 or so. So our 3 speakers tonight are Reverend Shanda Jha, Reverend Deborah Lee, and Reverend Bruce Reyes Chow. I'll introduce Reverend Shanda Jha first. Reverend Shanda Jha is a activist, writer, minister, and also does anti-racism and anti-oppression training. And she has done this work for the Peninsula Multifaith Coalition Anti-Racism Committee. She has been the pastor of the First Christian Church in Oakland, and then the executive director of the Oakland Peace Center. And she's a prolific author of several books, including, I'll just mention 3 that I happen to have here at hand: Transforming Communities, How People Like You Are Changing Their Neighborhoods, Pre-Post-Racial America, Spiritual Stories from the Front Line, and Liberating Love, 365 Love Notes from God. It's a daily devotional that uses both the Bible and personal inspiration on a daily basis to inspire you in your social justice and your spiritual life. Shanda is a minister in the Disciples of Christ denomination, and you'll hear shortly why we invited her to be part of this panel. Our second speaker is Reverend Deborah Lee, who I've known for many years, from the time when she was a seminarian at Pacific School of Religion. She's currently the executive director of the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, which is based in Oakland. And the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity had a previous name, the Interfaith Coalition for Immigrant Rights. And Deborah has been active in intersectional liberation movements for the past over 20 years, really. She does economic organizing, anti-racism organizing, advocacy for the incarcerated, advocacy for immigrants, and she is always on the front line, literally, of every social justice cause. She organizes monthly vigils at the ICE Detention Center in downtown San Francisco, which she was able to keep going via Zoom even during COVID. So you'll hear why we invited her too. She's also a distinguished theologian. She was for a very significant time the director of the Institute for the Pacific Asian North American Religious Studies Institute at Pacific School of Religion, which was at the time really the premier theological center for Asian and Asian American theology in the United States. So we welcome Reverend Deborah Lee. And finally, we have Reverend Bruce Reyes Chow. And Bruce Reyes Chow is an author, speaker, parent, consultant, coach, podcaster, and pastor. He speaks and writes on issues of faith, technology, race, parenting, and church culture. And he's been an ordained pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA for over 25 years. He's currently the senior pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Palo Alto. He also was a former moderator of the Presbyterian Church, the entire denomination. And he too is a distinguished author. And I will draw your attention to two of his books. One, But I Don't See You as an Asian, Curating Conversations About Race. And I draw your attention to this one because in June, on June 11th, the Peninsula Multifaith Coalition will be doing a book study on this book, and you're welcome to join us. And then his most recent book, just published, called In Defense of Kindness, Why It Matters, How It Changes Our Lives, and How It Can Save the World. And this is a brilliant read. And if you're looking for some inspiration that's practical, I urge you to go right out and order it or buy it. So we have these three great theologian, activists, prophets who are going to educate and inspire us tonight. And I'm going to ask them to each lead off by asking you, why did you say yes to be on this panel? What in your personal or professional life motivated you to agree to speak to us tonight about religious responses to anti-Asian violence?
So I said yes because Jim asked me.
That's true. Ditto.
I think
pretty much. That's Jim asked us, and we all said yes. And then we found out we were all going to be together.
That's true.
I hope we just don't start chit-chatting among ourselves because we're actually all good friends. So I'm so excited. I don't think the three of us have ever been together at the same gathering or event or anything. So
your ordination. We were all at your ordination.
Or that's right, my installation. That's right. That's right. We ate tacos. It was great. Right.
Okay, get back to the topic.
Right. Okay, the real answer to that question. Although, I mean, I will say Jim's been a mentor in how to integrate spirituality and activism for me over the years. So that was actually a reason I said yes. And because he keeps showing up for all of the people. I also have deep appreciation for what the Peninsula Multifaith Coalition is about and what you all are trying to create in your community. So that was another reason. But I think, Jim, what you're getting at is like, why is this personal to us? And I really appreciate that question because I think each of us comes from a different cultural background, and Asian American is such a big category. And when we talk about Asian Pacific Islanders, that's an even bigger group of people. And I think it's really important to remember that that was intentionally chosen as a political identity by folks in the late 1960s who were responding to the power of the Black Power movement and of the Brown Berets in the late 60s and early 70s. And for us to say, oh, we don't have a lot in common, except we all experience a shared version of oppression. And if we claim this identity as Asian Americans, it brings us into relationship in a different way. And so despite the fact that Bruce and Deb, you two and I come from very different cultures, I consider you family. And that matters a lot to me. And so what makes it personal to me? I think to be South Asian, and when I say South Asian, I mean people from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and the South Asian diaspora. Those of us who were South Asian Americans who went through 9/11, that experience was to live two completely different realities at the same time. We went through all the horrors that every person in the United States went through, the same loss, the same grief, the same devastation. And then on top of that, we experienced the profound fear and persecution. People from our community were sent back to Pakistan, even when they hadn't lived there before. People were rounded up. A lot of us experienced for many, many years afterwards disparate treatment in airports. And the first folks who showed up to speak out against it, and y'all have to remember, after 9/11, no one was speaking out against it. No one. The first folks to show up were Japanese American survivors of internment camps. And I'm never going to forget that they were like, yeah, we don't have a lot in common culturally, but we know what this is like, and we're not going to let it happen again. And so in the years since then, what it means to be Asian American has been that much more palpable to me. And so when we talk about what some people say is an 800% rise in anti-Asian violence in the past year, I know that I don't suffer in the same way that a lot of my friends who are much more visibly East Asian or Southeast Asian do. And it's still painful because that's still my family. And so that's why it's personal to me.
Oh gosh, why is it personal? Well, I mean, you just look at us, right? I mean, I think that there's something about an ability to sit in places of privilege when other groups are being attacked and intellectually understanding and even passionate and being out, and then there's your own people. And I think for me, pastoring a predominantly white congregation and being in a denomination that's predominantly white and being kind of white adjacent spaces, my role has tended to be one to be in those spaces and help folks understand different experiences in a way that's not just palatable but is meaningful. And so I remember preaching the sermon after all of this went down, and I think I started that sermon with, I'm exhausted, and I didn't do any of the prep that I usually do, and really felt like I needed to just kind of bear my spirit and my self to a community that I love and I think loves me, and we're trying to figure out what this all means, but to bring that proximity into a space that I've been called into. So it's personal because it was happening. It's also that for me, I also think that the Asian American community in itself, in its kind of monolithic political space, is so diverse in its approaches and responses that it was part of my calling into that was to make sure that our history of solidarity with our Black community, with the Black community, was not lost, because what you began to see was an increase in intentional, subtle, not so subtle anti-Blackness, increased calls for policing and carceral responses by folks who would claim they were supporters of Black Lives Matter, and so clearly didn't kind of get what that was about. And so kind of being in that space as well, and receiving a lot of heat for being in that space. And so just to kind of, it's personal on a lot of different fronts, which makes it even that much more exhausting, because we're kind of in multiple spaces, and those of us, and I think the three of us who are invited into those spaces, needing to kind of tend to our own spirits and souls in the middle of all of that, made it even more personal, that really having to focus on how do we make sure we tend to our own spirits, rather than just talking about something that was going on and helping to translate it. We're also having to deal with it. So on many different levels, very personal.
For me, our office is in Oakland, Chinatown. And so a lot of those incidents that happened are actually right under my window. I'm on the third floor. Yep. So it was very shocking to see. It was very shocking to see the impact on just about everybody in the community. Elders, women, and young people, seeing how people were having to make adjustments in their life and trying to strategize and think differently. And I think I'm here tonight because I haven't really been organizing in the API world for about a decade. I did that for a decade, And then I've been more in the world of immigration and also incarceration, which tends to be more Latino, Latina, and also African American and white folks too. So, and some Asian folks too, but I haven't been organizing primarily in that. And I have felt this important national moment that we're in was a really important moment to be able to think about the framing. How is tragedy and violence being framed? How are the proposals and responses and solutions that are offered? Where are those coming from? Who are they coming from? And so I'm here tonight because I want to be a part of these discussions that people are having to see how we could frame these in a way that would lead us towards some lasting solutions instead of the cyclical kinds of violence that, I used to say, oh, we felt like we had to respond 2 months ago to every call we were getting, every opportunity to speak, because we felt we were like the victims of the month, and then and sure enough, like a month later, it was like on to another story. So thank you for still talking about this in May, by the way. But, it was this idea of like, how do we actually try to get at some of the roots of these things and address this in a systemic way? That's not only for the Asian Pacific Islander community, but this is a case study and an example of how especially particularly communities of color, but also other minority communities are impacted by violence, by targeted violence, racialized violence in this country. I will just say one other thing. I grew up in Ohio, so I didn't, I consider myself a refugee from Ohio, because in Ohio, when I was 15 years old, Vincent Chin was killed in Detroit. And believe it or not, from Ohio to Detroit, that was like the closest place you'd go to buy Chinese groceries. It was about a 9-hour drive, but Bruce has all the privilege of growing up in California. You can't believe that. But Sean and I grew up in Ohio.
I'm from Akron.
And so I that feeling in the 1980s of, at that time, the anti-Japanese sentiment, because we were in a tire city.
Yep.
Everybody's dad worked for a tire company, and the US auto industry was tanking. And the face of the blame for that, was not, the industrial policy of the United States, but the face of that was Japan and anybody who looked Japanese. And so that was very palpable feeling. And, so it's interesting coming to California, which has always been a refuge, often been a refuge, particularly San Francisco for the Chinese American community, and to see these incidents happening in Oakland Chinatown, San Francisco Chinatown, which to me, like for the Chinese community, is our church. That's our sacred space, because you can go to any Chinatown and you feel at home. It's like going into a Catholic church, like any part of the world, you feel at home, when you go in there. And so that particular violation of that sacred space is very painful to see.
Yeah. There was something you said, Deb, that I'm wondering how y'all would feel about talking about this for a second. You had mentioned, what you were just reflecting on kind of put into my head this question of the ways in which, and I'm not sure whether everybody on this call knows the phrase, the model minority myth, but it was a phrase that started being used in 1968. It was a white academic published in, I want to say, Time magazine, talking about the model minority. And I find myself thinking, Deb, it was when you were saying, we were the pain of the month, right? And so people were very frenetic about talking about issues in the wake of those horrific murders in Atlanta, and then interest dwindled. And in some ways, this past year, some folks have been willing to talk about it because the violence has been so visible. But it's not the only time we've experienced marginalization. Filipinos arrived in this area in 1587, and Asian and Pacific Islanders have been experiencing marginalization on these lands since about 1587. So I wonder if you all have thoughts, because this is something I've been thinking about a lot, about the ways in which, and it also gets, Bruce, to what you were talking about around the ways in which anti-Blackness showed up in the midst of our community advocating for basic human rights for the Asian American community. I wonder if you all have thoughts on the ways in which this myth of Asian Americans as the model minority has been weaponized against us and has also been used to divide us from other communities of color, whether successfully or not. I would argue not always successfully. I know you both think about that, so I thought I would ask the question.
Yes, it's it was fun. I was just on had the privilege of being on a panel with Youth Community Service, which is an organization in Palo Alto that had these young people from Palo Alto, young Asian Americans who, Palo Alto, I'm new to the city, and we all have our stereotypes of the city, and some are true, some are not. But these are young people that were diving deep into this stuff that I was pleasantly surprised to hear them talking and doing some really strong analysis about being considered a model minority and what that has meant in their growing up in this city, and as they've experienced the violence and kind of the rhetoric around their lives, which I think has happened to all of us in a certain way. I mean, I'm half Filipino, half Chinese, so a little of my background, which I think would be helpful, is so I come out of Trinity Presbyterian Church in Stockton, which was founded out of the farm workers' strikes in the Central Valley before Filipinos who immigrated could own land. Members of our church who were born here were the first ones to be able to own land in California. When anti-miscegenation laws were in California, Filipinos in particular were named because white soldiers would go away to war and Filipino men would swoop in and start marrying their sisters and all that, and that started. So I grew up knowing all of that history and knowing, so why does so-and-so have the title to this land, but it's not their land? Well, it's because so-and-so couldn't own land. Or why were they married in Oregon? Well, because they couldn't get married here. And so all of that kind of helping to it's not at a competition or a comparison, but helping folks to realize, I think, that for Filipinos in particular, that a lot of the things that impacted African American folks through the years were kind of in parallel as we were here. And then I have my Chinese side, which brings in a whole nother thing, which early in my childhood, I learned that my Chinese side didn't like my Filipino side, and all that stuff started to play in. I mean, there's the complexity of homeland history and how Chinese were brought into the Philippines as middle class business people and what that did. So all of that comes into play for me as I think about getting just kind of set. And then when you get here and what you do, you're just supposed to be this particular way. And that model minority thing became a way to one-dimensionalize an entire group of people. So we had taken the political power of being Asian American, and that had been then constructed into this model minority, one thing that everybody could be. And white America can't really tell us apart anyway, so you can just all be that. And I'll just end with one quick story. I was never a model minority in terms of my performance.
You're still not, Bruce.
I'm still not. No, I still very much am not. But I distinctly remember I did make it to calculus in my senior year in high school. I don't know how I did that, but I didn't understand it. And I remember people cheating off of me in calculus. And I'm sitting there going, you can keep cheating off me because I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And I remember them getting bad grades and being like, and I'm like, yeah, I'm failing this class, but you're assuming that I am this. I mean, so everything from those, I don't even really call them microaggressions anymore. There's all these aggressions that have impacted and continue today. I mean, my kids, they still get told what a great tan they have. And they're like, that's my skin. Thank you. So, all that stuff. And then one last, I'm sorry, is that going back, Deborah, what you were talking about, when all this started to happen, I think it was the first time that I was seriously concerned about my parents going outside. I mean, you're always concerned about your parents, but it was, I think, really the first time that I felt like I had to have the talk with my dad, because he'll just go out and do whatever he wants to do. So he may be here today. I better watch out. But I mean, that, just going back to what you said, is another one of those things. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
Yep.
I like what you said about how you can only be one thing. And I think this is the story of race in America. If you're this race, this is what you can be. And unfortunately, I think the model minority stereotype is the one thing you can be. And for the Black community, the one thing you can be is criminal. That's how, being Black has been criminalized. And so these things are in conflict and in conversation with each other. And so many Chinese immigrants, I'll speak for my own community, we come to this country. We've never gotten like Asian American history. We don't understand that the immigration laws that changed in 1965 were because of the civil rights movement, led by the African American. We don't understand why. If I'm in Chinatown, the only African American people that people are seeing walking around Chinatown are indigent. Like, what impact does that have on people's understanding of this country? Because our urban areas, because people have been so neglected, and certain neighborhoods in particular are completely neglected. So I think that there's a real danger, I felt like, in some of the narrative that was coming out of, like the Asian victim narrative, the innocent victim narrative. And I think that's really not helpful, and it's not true. And it doesn't speak to sort of the empowerment and the solidarity that is part of our nation's story. And I think we have to look at the underlying story of racism in this country, and particularly white superiority in this country, that has kind of laid out this order of things, right? This order of things, and who can be what, and what we expect, and not really see the complexity of a whole community and the complexity of people.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think one of the other things that I've been thinking a lot about is the ways in which anybody who doesn't fit that, so that label wasn't created by Asian Americans. The reason Asian American was created was because of generations of marginalization and oppression and the sense of wanting to come together in solidarity. And alongside that, someone from outside of the community, a white person, created this term model minority, which, if it describes you, you get pretty excited about it, right? That's pretty great. Look at our group. We're doing so well. And what happens in that process is it erases so many people and stops any attention being given to Asian American and Pacific Islanders who aren't doing well, who are struggling, who are in sex work or in low wage work, or all of the things that were unearthed for certain parts of the community with the shootings in Atlanta, right? That there are huge swaths of the community that are not doing well, and who the myth is erasing their reality from anybody's vision, including people within our community, are ignoring because they make us look bad, right? And who are we if people realize we're not all thriving? The other thing that I think breaks my heart a little bit is part of where that identity as Asian American came from was because of a sense of solidarity, because there had been ways in which our movements were learning from each other and trying to build with each other. And nobody ever hears the stories of Asian Black solidarity or Asian Latinx solidarity. And I think that that's a huge loss, because we tend to think the Asian community is off here by ourselves, when throughout American history, there are stories, there are movements that have been built by Pan-Asian solidarity, by Asian, Bruce, I've heard you talk about the United Farm Workers on more than one occasion. And I think that those stories get buried. And so we get marginalized, and we're robbed of the imagination for what could be today based on what's happened throughout our history. We don't learn about Grace Lee Boggs. We don't learn about Yuri Kochiyama. We don't learn about the folks who have built a cross-racial solidarity movement that are our ancestors.
There's not enough resources and investment and organizing about bringing our communities together to understand our histories and our stories. And that's, you know, a lot of times our communities are actually living. I was just in Visitation Valley, you know, the other day, and it's like what was predominantly the Black neighborhood is now predominantly Asian neighborhood. And so how's that going? You know, like, how is that going, right? And what is that? It's an opportunity that instead is often getting posed as conflict. I think that this moment is a wake-up call for a lot of Asian Americans, like new awakening around it, because they may have believed the model minority myth and thought, oh, we're almost white, nothing bad is going to happen to us. And then, you know, we're reminded that you know, this racism is very deep and embedded, and it will happen to different ethnic and racial communities in different ways. It's still there, and we have to see how it maybe has a common core that we should be looking at.
But you know, I think the model minority thing comes into as people respond to how Asian Americans have responded. You know, trying to intellectualize anger or be even our own people kind of the idea that you kind of keep your head down, and you don't make a wave, and you just kind of get through. And then you have these folks, and I would say a lot of Asian American women who have been on the forefront of responding in ways that are unstereotypical and have been really kind of pushed back on because they're not fitting not just an Asian American, but an Asian female narrative that is getting just shattered. And, you know, and it's our, you know, in some ways our own folks are struggling with our own community's level of anger and how do we, when it's always been there, we've just never had the permission and space to express it. And I think that's a piece that I think for our own communities is how do we disentangle ourselves from what was a political positive of being Asian American into now that it's so intertwined that we've almost forgotten what it means to be that political movement, and we've bought into and replaced it with this. Yes, we are this monolithic thing, and if you step out of that, then in some way you're against. I mean, I've been called a traitor on multiple occasions for defending, you know, for kind of pushing back on anti-blackness, and well, you should. They're basically arguing that they should be able to be anti-black because they're defending Asian Americans, and I'm like, that's not how it works. So I mean, I think that whole model is seeps so much into our own psyche that we got. And you know, you look at affirmative action, all these things where in San Francisco it's happening greatly around Lowell High School, and I mean all this stuff that just keeps popping up and keeps popping up. And you know, I think the way to do is we get our young people to start pushing and exploring different ways of being in the world so that just breaks down, because I think in so many ways my kids, friends who maybe parents have bought into that a little more, like there's no way they're going to let them go into humanities. Like there's this and learn this history and learn all this other stuff. It's like this model minority path that some reason we're supposed to do. So how do we begin to honor the breadth of what we can be as Asian Americans? I mean, I think that's ultimately what we're trying to get to, but we won't even allow sometimes ourselves to do it. So.
Yeah, I think I heard the statistic that the majority of the hate incidents, you know, now they say it's like 6,600 hate incidents in the last year. You know, the majority have been, the perpetrators have been white women.
Oh.
Yes, it was on a Code Switch episode. That will be my source. But
I'll trust Code Switch. Code Switch is good.
Wait, but I just read.
I was white men, but
90. I read 90% were white men.
Oh, well, really?
There's a couple reports out now. This is where it's all getting confusing, but
okay. But it's not white.
Yeah, there you go.
You know, but it's like that. But where the focus goes, like for
yeah.
our own communities, for like the media, where the focus goes, you know, is very different.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, every video you see, the ones that get played over and over again are not of the majority of incidents that are happening. I mean, I know in my own life, most of the things that have been said to me that have been micro or major aggressions have been white men for the most part. And so, you know, I think for any Asian American out there, I just like think about how this has impacted you.
Yeah.
And is this really the truth about what you're now seeing, and be more discerning about the things we're now absorbing and then expressing out into the world. I mean, if we could all be better, we'd obviously be doing it, but you know.
Sure.
Yeah, because I think, you know, the Asian American community is experiencing a safety crisis.
Yeah.
Like that has peaked during this COVID pandemic. And other communities also experience a safety crisis every day, right? And there has to be a way that we can hold these two crises together and understand them together, and posit solutions that understand them together.
No, I really appreciate you saying that. Bruce, you were saying like this was the first time you had to worry about your father.
Yep.
My father had to go to a bank in Cleveland 4 days after 9/11, and I begged him not to. And the thing is, I was talking about police reform with some friends over Easter dinner, and my friends sitting, and several of us who were people of color were engaging it from the experience of the impact it has on people of color. And several of the white folks were talking about it as an academic exercise. And finally, one of my friends who's African-American, she didn't make eye contact with anyone at the table but me. And she just said in a very low voice, every single time my son leaves the house, I have to worry about his life. And there was this moment where, it's not an abstraction. And this is a moment for us to kind of get an opportunity at solidarity, right? To understand. Yeah. So thank you both for naming that. I think I don't know that that's something other people outside the API community need to think too much about, but I know it's something we really, really need to think about.
This is what they get for just spotlighting the three of us. It's like we're sitting around a table at a cafe.
Well, listen, this is Jim, and I want to ask your opinion about something, and because of the phrase safety crisis that you used. Last week, President Biden signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. Just that name is so interesting. I mean, what?
Like COVID-19 is experiencing hate crimes?
And I want to urge people to Google it and actually read it, because it's a fascinating law, but that is what it's called, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. And this is what he said, because it was to challenge, to make it more possible to report anti-Asian hate crimes. Hate has no place in America, and I look forward to making that clear this afternoon by signing the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law. And Vice President Harris said this when she was introducing the president about anti-Asian violence. This violence, it did not come from nowhere, and none of it is new. In my life, my lived experience, I've seen how hate can pervade our communities. I've seen how hate can impede our progress, and I've seen how people uniting against hate can strengthen our country. Here's the truth. Racism exists in America. Xenophobia exists in America. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, it all exists. And so the work to address injustice wherever it exists remains the work ahead. So, I mean, what do you think about this? The president and the vice president addressing anti-Asian violence, and Congress signing a law to make it easier to report hate crimes. Is this good? Is this progress? What do you think?
So there are a lot of people that did not support this because it relies on increased police funding and carceral responses. And so it's one of those really interesting conversations. I'm going to put in the chat a link to 100 plus organizations, Asian American and LGBTQA organizations that signed against it. Because this is not a surprise coming from Biden either, that it's a increased funding for police, and it kind of the anti-blackness baked into this. And so, this is one of those times where you struggle with how do you speak around things that seem like great, we're going to talk about anti-hate. That's awesome. But you dive down into this and it just reinforces some of the division and creating some of the same problems that existed before, and just making worse. I mean, if you believe that part of our problem around white supremacy in the United States is around policing and law enforcement, why are we going to continue to fund the same system? Why can't we shift in the way that we understand public safety and responses? And this is a bill that did not address those kinds of things. So there are a lot of folks that were not particularly supportive of the nuts and bolts of it, though we do understand in many ways yes, it is good that we're talking about it, but the legalities and the things in it were not very helpful. So I just put a link in there. You can take a read of all the organizations and why folks signed on against it.
Yeah, I was super moved. I was saying earlier, I was super moved by the speech. I was even a little bit teary because the model minority myth also invisibilizes the ways in which API folks suffer, right? And so for anybody in a position of authority to be saying, I see you, was just earth-shattering to me. It was, I don't think I've seen it in my lifetime, at least my life in this country. And that was such a big deal to me. And then it was heartbreaking to realize that it was the other way the model minority myth shows up for us, which is we will give you access to some privilege or protection as long as it is at the expense of Black folks. And that's what's so painful is that so often the options we're given are remain invisible, suffer in silence, or benefit at the expense of other people. And that's a hard thing for us to be navigating. So I appreciate you saying that. I know you had thoughts too, Deb.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that this, this translates to how we think about solving this safety crisis at a local level as well. So I think that this conversation about what strategy will we use as a society to address this is going to be important, because it's probably showing up at your city council and then your police budget right now. And I think for the API community, there's a lot of reasons why people have not ever called the police, have not trusted the police. This is some Bay Area statistics. 1 in 4 in the Bay Area is Asian Pacific Islander. 1 in 6 of every person in the Bay Area is an API immigrant. There's a lot of reasons why immigrants won't call the police. Because of the history of Chinese exclusion, there are people who are going to die to take their immigration status story to the grave, and they're never going to call the police and get the police involved. And when you call the police, it's usually too late. The crime has already happened, right? I think I know that I've heard, especially in Oakland and in San Francisco, a lot of complaints that there's very few, very inadequate victim services. Like if we're really concerned about people who have been harmed, there's very few victim services in the languages that they need it, for the resources that they need it. Like you think about therapy and counseling, like trauma recovery, all of that. Like, is that even available to the community? So it's like, how could we choose to heal and not, choose a law enforcement response, which unfortunately, was where I think a lot of that money is going to go. But of course, the symbolism, and I do think the Biden administration is good on symbolism. They're saying the things, they're saying like symbolic things that are very touching and meaningful. But we really have to look at the details. I heard one other critique of this whole like AAPI thing. It's like, are we privileging Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Americans? Like, if we're so concerned about violence, stop the violence for AAPI. Like, what about stopping the violence on Asians and Pacific Islanders? And I think this is the piece where we have to think about, we are in a drumming up, both political parties have been drumming up a Cold War against China for the last 70 years. And every time they do that, it puts Asian Americans at risk. And we have 300 US military bases in the Asia Pacific region right now. So what about their lives? The Asian women, who are, systematically abused, by the US military presence in these places. So I think that was kind of an interesting point to make, when we say stop AAPI violence. And, what about, and so I'm worried that also this hate crime, it gets seen as this exceptionalizing. And then it could be like, oh, well, their pain, it gets to be exceptionalized. Although reporting, documentation of hate crimes, that is a very important statistic to have. And I know that many states don't even count those things.
Well, and it's interesting because the confluence of, the hate crimes that we're responding to right now are the direct result of xenophobia, that were anti-China was anti-China rhetoric. We as a nation historically do not do a great job of separating a government from its people. And I know a lot of my, I'm not going to go down that road. Sorry. And I think that part of what's heartbreaking is that we've forgotten the origin was ugly, violent political rhetoric about a government that then got expanded and applied to a race. Yeah. And the same thing happened after 9/11, right? I mean, Sikhs were attacked at a very high rate. Hindus were attacked at a very high rate. Muslims from countries that had nothing to do with Afghanistan were attacked at high rates. Mexican Americans and indigenous people were attacked because the rhetoric coming from the halls of power were about a political entity that was analogized to a religion that in this country is analogized to a skin color. And so people saw brown, and that was the same as terrorist, right? And so
Sean,
we are supposed to switch gears now. Yeah.
I hate to stop you, but we're about to go to small groups, but I want to give you each like a lightning round. One best minute on, this is a group of religious people. That's why we're here in this group tonight. Yeah. What do you think, what does our religion have to say to us? And we're different religions. You know, we actually are Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus. This is the strength of the Multifaith Coalition. It's unlike any other I've ever worked with or seen in terms of its religious diversity. What is that? What do we do about anti-Asian violence coming from our religious place?
Well, and out of my church, I don't, I've always approached the world and have been taught this throughout, that, if one part of the body is in pain, we're all in pain. And so if you believe that and you live that, then you can't do one thing at the expense of the other or ignore the pain of another part of the body. And when you know that it's in pain and you choose to avoid it, then that turns us away from our understanding of what the whole is in our lives and our community. And I choose not to do that. And I encourage the people I serve not to do that. When we know, we make a choice whether we turn towards or away from the one who wants us to be better. And we're always trying to turn towards a more whole and healthy world.
I'd say, from the faith community, I think we have a special call to prevent harm. There's some harm, like an earthquake, you can't prevent that. But I think, where can we prevent harm? And so that makes us have to really define the problem and understand where it's coming from. And I think in that prevention of harm, I'd say we're not just looking at the individual one-to-one harm, but really the state, the structural harm that continues to happen. And just thinking about the immigration system, there's like 500,000 Californians are undocumented who are Asian Pacific Islander. And so when we think about the violence that's occurring every day through our policies, like to also think about that, not just like the interpersonal harm that you might hear about at the grocery store or something.
Yeah. I want to use this as an excuse to celebrate one of my favorite young adults that I've ever worked with, a man named Robin Gorung. He was a Bhutanese refugee. He lost almost all of his family to a violent dictatorship in Bhutan. At the age of 12, he got paramilitary training by the resistance movement with the goal, he was determined to kill all of the brutal violators of his family's life. And for some reason in the refugee camp, he encountered, I think it was a Buddhist monk, who helped him realize how his soul was being damaged in his pursuit of vengeance. And Robin now is organizing Bhutanese youth to give them political education, to connect them to pacifist strategies. He's a yoga instructor and teaches them mindfulness and meditation to deal with the trauma of being refugees who have lost so many family members to a dictatorship no one ever talks about. and he's training them in political advancement so that they can organize to bring attention to their community's needs. And to me, that connection to soul repair, connection to community, and connection to political transformation is some of the best that our spiritual communities can do. And I think all of our traditions can speak to it. So I posted a link because he's doing a fundraiser right now, and I'm so proud of him and the work he's doing that I thought I would give him a little shout out.
I want to thank all three of you. You have quickened our spirits and quickened our minds. A lot to think about and a lot to pray about and a lot to feel. So we're going to spend, I'm going to ask if you're at this panel to spend 25 minutes in small group discussion with other people who've been here listening to this. Oh, I want to give our panelists a chance to say the one thing that they want to say to us before we end tonight. So I'll call on them serially. Shonda, what do you want to say? What's your parting shot for us?
So I'm a Christian minister, but my father was Hindu, and I was raised with a deep appreciation of both traditions. And I've been given the gift of revisiting a lot of Hindu stories through a liberation theology lens. And I find myself thinking about the fact that Krishna, one of the most heroic gods in the Hindu pantheon, was born in prison. His mother had been imprisoned. He was born there. I visited the prison, or a recreation of it. And I get to claim two different traditions that both say there is a path to liberation for all of God's creatures. And I think that that is the gift of the work that we get to do together. And so the theme that I really appreciated Bruce and Deb lifting up repeatedly was, we don't want to take priority over any other group, because as spiritually grounded folks, it needs to be all of us who are getting liberated together. And I think it's a deeply theological practice.
Great. And Shonda and the others, I want to be sure if there's a way that people can get in touch with you or something you want to promote or something like that, put it in the chat right now so that before we depart, so they can follow up. Bruce.
Oh my goodness! Last words. So I come out of a Christian tradition, and so I'm gonna stay in that. Well, really, whatever your tradition you have, if there is a version of your tradition out there that is toxic and dangerous and violent, call it out. And not only that, put out the better version of your tradition and faith. I mean, I feel like so many of us, in an act of, I think, false humility, hold back our faith of justice and care and compassion and love, and because we don't want to seem like what other people do. And I think we've abdicated space that hasn't created a lot of this, but certainly has allowed it to move on. And so I would, for those of you, if you are in the Christian tradition and you are wary of talking about your faith out in the world, I encourage us to be more imaginative of how we can do that in a way that isn't the way others do it, that we don't like, but promotes a version of our tradition that is honestly better than what else is out there.
Great. And Deborah.
I would say your solidarity really matters. It's not over, it's beyond the flavor of the month. It's not over, it's still ongoing. And so anything that you can do is really, really important. Your gesture as a faith community, your gesture as, as a neighborhood, those are really important. And just to remember that there's, I'm going to a rally tomorrow for a man, Lum, who's been in this country since he was a kid, and he may be facing deportation back to Vietnam next week. And so just to remember that this violence is not just interpersonal, but it's structural, and look for ways that we can be looking at anti-Asian violence, anti-violence against other communities as well that are structural, and addressing and preventing those.
Right. I want to ask us if we can express our applause and our appreciation to our panelists in ways that they can see our hands. We have been in the presence. Thank you so much. And I want to say that if you like this program and if you want to support the programs of the Peninsula Multifaith Coalition, you can send us a check. We welcome financial support from individuals, or you can make sure that your faith house sends in a dues check. You know, we welcome anything, you know, whether large or small. $100 check from your faith house makes a difference. A $500 check from your faith house makes a difference. So that's how we pay for events like this. So please express your financial support. A couple things coming up on June 11th, a book study on Bruce Reyes Chow's book, But I Don't See You as Asian, curating conversations about race.
Am I coming to that?
I don't know. Do you want to come?
Oh, I don't know. I was like, they mentioned, like, oh, is that on my calendar?
I'd love
to come.
Cool. Send
me the link. I can pop in. That's if I'm around.
Cool.
Oh, absolutely. Very cool.
But I will also do a plug for the Kindness book, his new book, which is very cool.
We're definitely getting that one.
Yep.
And then on June 30th, we're doing what we're calling a Summer of Good Trouble in honor of John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, who died a year ago. So on June 30th, we're doing a book reading of the book March. It's the first volume in his 3-volume set of graphic novels, and it's about the March on Washington. The Silicon Valley Foundation has given us money to give away 50 copies to anyone 21 or under who wants a free copy, or anyone who asks for it. So get on our mailing list and you'll find out about it, or follow us on Facebook. On July 17th, we're showing the documentary film about John Lewis called Good Trouble at night, on a Saturday night in the parking lot of the Latter-day Saint Church in Foster City. And on August 15th, we're doing a March for Racial Equality in the spirit of John Lewis on a Sunday afternoon in downtown San Mateo in Central Park. So these are some things we've got planned specifically as activities to keep this kind of conversation alive and active. So that's what we've got going on. Thanks. I'm trying to read things in the chat, but I can't read them quickly enough. So thanks for being here tonight. And if you're not on our mailing list and want to be sure to send us an email at the Peninsula Multifaith Coalition on our website or on the Facebook page, or if you put it in the chat, we'll capture it before we sign off. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks all. Thanks for having us.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
You.
Thank you.
Everybody. Bye.
Night.
Bye. Night, Sherry.
Bye.
Thanks, Kendall.
Bye.
What was the date of the San Mateo event?
August 15th.
August 15th?
Yep.
In the afternoon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
All right.
I always hang out just to check in and see how y'all are feeling at the end of a thing.
First of all, thank you, Shonda, because you were fantastic in every way, before, during, and after. So thank you. Really. And I'm not just saying this because I thought this up. The three of you should have a talk show. Because